Hey everyone, it's JK. Before we start, I want to know where you're listening from. Drop your country in the comments below. I've never shared this story before. It's one of those memories that sits quietly inside you for years until something forces it back into the light. A few weeks ago, during an interview that was supposed to be about music and the future, I said something about Jimin that no one expected. And since that moment, my world has been unusually silent. Like the calm that comes after a storm, but before you realize the damage it left behind. Everyone's been asking what I meant by it, what made me say those words. Some people thought it was a confession. Others thought it was regret. But the truth is, it was something deeper, something I didn't plan to share. That day started like any other. Cameras, lights, a table of microphones, a dozen faces waiting for answers. The kind of day where you speak in rhythm and the world listens in fragments. They asked about success, about schedules, about the next album. I gave the usual answers: safe, polite, professional. Then came the question that changed the tone entirely. Jungkook, if there's one person who has shaped the way you see yourself today, who would that be? It should have been easy. I've worked with so many people, admired so many, but without thinking, I said Jimin. And then I added something that wasn't in the script. He taught me more about love than anyone else. The room went silent. Not the professional silence of a studio, but a heavy, stunned quiet where even breathing feels too loud. I saw the interviewer's eyes widen, then soften, as if they didn't know whether to push for more or let it hang in the air. I smiled awkwardly, but inside, my heart was racing. Because in that one sentence, I had exposed years of emotion that I'd buried beneath rehearsals, awards, and world tours. When the interview ended, I walked out to the parking lot behind the studio. It was evening, and the sky had that strange gold and gray mix that always feels like nostalgia trying to find its way back home. I sat in my car for a long time, reading the headlines already popping up on my phone. Jungkook's mysterious statement about Jimin stuns fans. Did Jungkook just confess something to Jimin? What did he really mean? I should have known it would blow up. But what surprised me was how much it affected me. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about the noise outside. I was listening to the silence inside. That silence carried me back to the beginning, to the years when we were just trainees. When success was still a dream, and Jimin was the person who kept me from giving up on myself. I remember one night vividly. We were in the practice room, exhausted, both of us drenched in sweat and frustration. I was younger, impatient, full of self-doubt. I had messed up the choreography for the third time, and I could feel my confidence crumbling. I threw my cap across the room and said, maybe I'm not meant for this. Jimin looked at me, not with pity, but with something far more powerful. You don't quit because it's hard, Jungkook, he said quietly. You keep going until it feels like breathing. Then he turned the music back on, and we kept dancing. That moment changed everything for me. It wasn't just encouragement. It was faith, his belief that I could be more than my frustration, more than my mistakes. Years later, when the world started calling me the Golden Maknae, I used to think about that moment. People saw perfection, but Jimin saw the process, the struggle behind the smile. There's something humbling about that, about having someone who witnesses your becoming long before the world does. But somewhere along the way, as fame grew louder, our conversations grew quieter. We didn't drift apart in anger or betrayal. We drifted apart in silence, buried beneath schedules and expectations. And I think that's what hurt the most, not losing each other, but realizing we didn't even notice the distance growing until it was already there. The thing about being in this industry is that it teaches you to perform emotions even when you're empty. You learn how to smile while breaking, how to thank the crowd while losing pieces of yourself. And sometimes, it takes one person's absence to make you realize how much of your authenticity was tied to their presence. Jimin was that for me. He was my compass in the chaos. When I said he taught me more about love than anyone else, I didn't mean romance. I meant something deeper. Love as awareness, as patience, as seeing someone at their lowest and still choosing to stand beside them. After that interview, I didn't call him. I couldn't. I told myself it was because I was busy. But the truth was, I was scared. Scared he'd think I'd said too much, or maybe not enough. Scared he'd laugh it off, or worse, stay silent. For days, I kept replaying his voice in my mind, the way he used to say my name, the way he laughed when I said something stupid. I kept thinking about how many things we never said when we had the chance. How often we replaced honesty with humor, vulnerability with distraction. That's the strange thing about friendship. It can survive everything except what's left unsaid. A week after the interview, I got a message from him. Just one line. I saw it. No emojis, no explanation. My heart stopped for a moment. I didn't know whether he was angry, touched, or just curious. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes before replying. I meant it. That was all I could write. I pressed send, turned off my phone, and walked out into the night. There's a park near my place that I go to when I need to think. It's quiet, with a small bench overlooking the city lights. I sat there and thought about all the years that had passed. All the things we'd both sacrificed for dreams we once whispered about in tiny rooms with cracked mirrors. I thought about how we started as strangers, forced to share a dream, and how somewhere along the way we became brothers without realizing it. But brothers can hurt each other too, not with words, but with distance. And that night, I realized that what I said in that interview wasn't planned or polished. It was something that had been waiting to escape for years. A truth that didn't need permission. A confession not of love, but of gratitude. Gratitude for someone who saw me before the world did, and believed in me even when I couldn't believe in myself. 2 days later, I received another message from Jimin. It said, "Let's talk when you're ready. That's all. Simple, no judgment, no questions, just space." And that's when I understood the lesson behind everything we'd been through. Love, real love, whether it's friendship or family, isn't about constant communication or grand gestures. It's about space. Space that's safe enough to grow in, to fail in, to return to. That's what Jimin has always given me. Space to be human. When I think about that now, I realize how easily fame can make you forget the people who made you feel seen before the spotlight ever did. It's ironic, isn't it? The brighter the light, the harder it becomes to see what's right in front of you. I had to learn that the hard way. For years, I measured my worth in views, awards, and applause. I thought success meant proving something to the world. But standing there in that interview room, saying Jimin's name out loud, I realized that success means something much quieter. It's the ability to look back at your journey and know you didn't lose the people who mattered most along the way. That night, after I got his message, I sat at my piano and started playing a melody I hadn't touched in years. It was the same one Jimin and I had written together one rainy evening long ago, when we didn't have much, just a shared dream and a cracked window that let the sound of rain mix with our laughter. I played it slowly, letting every note remind me of who I was before everything became so loud. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about charts or numbers. I was just there, fully present, hearing the echoes of our beginnings. And I realized that maybe presence is the real luxury of life, the thing fame takes away if you let it. I don't know what people expected me to mean when I said what I did about Jimin. Maybe they wanted a story of betrayal, or hidden love, or dramatic revelation. But the truth is quieter. It's about learning that even in a life filled with noise and motion, the people who matter most are the ones who remind you how to be still. Jimin was that reminder. He still is. In the days that followed, I noticed something shifting inside me. I started putting my phone down during meals. I started answering messages from friends I hadn't spoken to in months. I began to feel more grateful, not for the achievements, but for the moments between them. The moments that don't make headlines, but make you human. And every time someone asked me about Jimin in interviews after that, I didn't shy away. I spoke his name with the calm certainty of someone who finally understands what it means to honor another person's presence in your life. People think that revelations come in grand, cinematic moments. But sometimes they come quietly in a sentence you didn't plan to say, in a silence that feels like truth. That's what that interview was for me. It wasn't an announcement. It was a realization, a crack in the surface that let something real finally breathe. I guess what I'm trying to say is this. In a world that measures everything by how much you've achieved, it's easy to forget that the greatest success is how deeply you've lived and how sincerely you've loved. I've been given everything: fame, opportunity, recognition, but none of it compares to the simple, grounding presence of someone who's known you since before you knew yourself. That's what Jimin represents to me. Not perfection, not the past, but the reminder that we're all still becoming. And maybe that's why I said what I said. Because sometimes silence turns into gratitude when you least expect it. Because sometimes one name can carry an entire history of unspoken moments. And because some truths, no matter how long you keep them hidden, always find their way out often when you're not trying to say anything at all. So if you've ever had someone in your life who believed in you when you didn't, who saw the best in you even when you were blind to it, tell them. Don't wait for the right time or the perfect setting or an audience. Just tell them. Because love, real love, doesn't wait for perfect timing. It just needs honesty. That's what I learned from Jimin. That's what I wanted to say all along. And maybe that's what I meant when I said he taught me more about love than anyone else. Not romantic love, not the kind that fades when things get complicated, but the kind that stays even when everything else changes. The kind that forgives distance, that survives silence, that grows through everything. And so when I look back on that interview now, I don't regret what I said. I'm grateful because maybe the world misunderstood it, but the person who needed to understand did. And that's enough. So to everyone watching, listening, wherever you are, USA, UK, Australia, the Philippines, or anywhere in between, this is what I want you to take from my story. Don't let the noise of life drown out the people who make your heart quiet. Don't chase so hard after success that you forget what it feels like to be present. Because one day, when the lights fade and the applause stops, it's not the achievements you'll remember, it's the moments you truly lived, and the people who were there with you. That's what that unexpected moment taught me. That's what Jimin reminded me of. And maybe, just maybe, that's what love really means. The days that followed that interview felt strangely weightless. Fame has a rhythm, noise, flashes, movement, but after those words escaped my mouth, the rhythm broke. My schedule went on as usual. Rehearsals, recordings, flights, interviews, but underneath it all, something in me had shifted. It was as if the world had turned down its volume just enough for me to hear my own thoughts again. Everywhere I went, I saw his name. Fans were analyzing every syllable, every micro-expression, every pause in my voice when I said Jimin. They slowed down the video, studied the lighting, created theories about what I truly meant. It was fascinating and painful at the same time to see something so deeply personal turned into a spectacle of speculation. But behind all that noise, there was one simple truth. I hadn't spoken to him yet. That silence between us wasn't new. It had been quietly growing for years, unnoticed until now. We saw each other often enough on stages, in photos, in videos, but that's not the same as seeing someone. Fame can make you visible to millions and invisible to yourself at the same time. And maybe that's why my words came out the way they did in that interview. They weren't planned. They were a slip from the part of me that still missed being seen by someone who knew me before all this began. 3 nights after the interview, I found myself standing outside Jimin's apartment building. Seoul was unusually quiet that night. Even the city lights felt dimmer, softer. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't even know if I had the courage to ring the bell. I just stood there, staring at the building, remembering the first time I came here years ago with a takeout box and a joke that made him laugh until he cried. I remembered the warmth of that memory, the simplicity of it, and I realized how far we'd both drifted from that kind of simplicity. I took a deep breath and walked inside. He opened the door before I even knocked. "You're predictable," he said, smiling faintly. His voice was calm, familiar. That smile didn't belong to a superstar. It belonged to the person who used to scold me for skipping meals. I froze for a moment. For all the rehearsed answers I give to the world, I didn't have one for this. "Can I come in?" I finally managed. He nodded, stepping aside. The apartment was quiet, dimly lit, filled with traces of who he was. Books on the floor, a half-finished candle, framed Polaroids of moments too real for the internet. We didn't say anything for a while. There are silences that suffocate, and there are silences that heal. This one felt like both. I sat on the couch. He poured tea. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I remembered. "You really meant it, didn't you?" I nodded. Every word. He looked down at his cup, the steam blurring his expression. "I didn't expect it. Not like that. The world heard something raw. I could feel it. I didn't plan to say it, I confess. It just came out. Maybe it's something I should have said years ago. He sighed, setting the cup on the table. You always say the things that matter too late, Jungkook. His words weren't cruel, they were true. And truth, when it comes from someone who knows you deeply, doesn't sting. It settles. I leaned back and closed my eyes. You're right. I've been too focused on everything except the people who made it all meaningful. He sat beside me. For a long time, we didn't speak. The city hummed faintly outside. Then he said something that stayed with me. You know, I used to think we were unstoppable. Not just as a group, but as people. Like we'd figured out what it means to live with purpose. But somewhere along the way, I realized that purpose without peace feels empty. I turned to look at him. His eyes were calm, but behind them was a quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of carrying the weight of everyone's expectations. I know what you mean, I said. I've spent so much time trying to prove something to the world, to myself. But that moment in the interview, it reminded me that I don't even know who I'm proving it to anymore. He smiled faintly. You don't have to prove anything to me. I know, I said, and for the first time in years, I believed it. We talked for hours that night, about things we hadn't said. About the nights we'd fought and the mornings we'd laughed like nothing happened. About the loneliness that comes even when you're surrounded by love. There's something strange about reconnecting with someone who's known you for so long. It's like rediscovering a version of yourself that you forgot existed. I told him how that question in the interview caught me off guard. How his name was the first thing that came to my mind. He laughed quietly. I guess that's what happens when someone becomes part of your story, he said. You don't even have to think their name just lives somewhere in your heartbeat. Something about that line broke me open a little. We sat there, both silent, both understanding too much without needing to explain. And that's when I realized, maybe the most meaningful relationships aren't the loud ones, the ones that make headlines or fan theories. They're the quiet ones that survive distance, misunderstanding, and silence. They're the ones that return in moments like this, not with fireworks, but with calm recognition. At some point, we went to the balcony. The night air was cold, but it felt grounding. Below us, the city glowed in a mosaic of neon and quiet streets. He leaned on the railing and said, Do you remember that night in Busan? The storm? I nodded instantly. How could I forget? We'd been scheduled for a small local performance, but the rain came down so hard the venue lost power. Everyone was frustrated. We waited in a small backstage room, damp and tired. I was pacing, angry at the delay, and Jimin just sat there, watching the rain hit the windows. Then he said something I didn't understand back then. Maybe the universe slows us down when we forget what we're running toward. He brought that night up again now, and I laughed softly. I thought you were just trying to sound deep. I was, he admitted, smiling. But I guess I was right too. We were running too fast, Jungkook. Maybe we still are. His words lingered in the air, mixing with the city's heartbeat. And I thought about all the ways life speeds up without asking for permission. About how success tricks you into believing momentum equals meaning. And I realized that what he said back then and now was the same truth wrapped in different silences. Slow down, be present. We stayed out there until nearly 3 a.m., saying little, just existing in the same space again. When I finally stood to leave, he didn't try to stop me. He just said, Don't let what's loud drown out what's real. I nodded. I won't. On my drive home, I kept hearing that line over and over. Don't let what's loud drown out what's real. It became something of a mantra. Every time my phone lit up with messages or mentions, I reminded myself that not all noise is connection. And in the quiet moments, the kind you only get at 2 a.m. when the city sleeps, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, peace. The following weeks were different. I didn't change overnight. Transformation isn't cinematic. It's quiet. I started paying attention to small things, to faces, to the silence between conversations. I began keeping a notebook, jotting down moments where I felt genuinely present. One entry read, A fan smiled at me today not because I waved, but because I looked back. Another said, I heard Jimin laugh on the phone. It sounded like home. Jimin and I started talking more. Not every day, not like before, but enough. Sometimes about music, sometimes about nothing. Once he sent me an old video of us rehearsing in that dusty room with the broken mirror. We were younger, wilder, full of hunger. I watched it alone at night, tears running down my face before I even realized why. It wasn't sadness, it was gratitude. Gratitude for having lived something so real that it could still make me feel years later. I started seeing our relationship not as something that needed to be fixed, but as something that had simply evolved. People talk about friendship as if it's static, but it's not. It breathes, changes, learns to survive new versions of us. And maybe that's the greatest form of love there is, the kind that allows for distance without disappearing. One night, I got another message from him. "You should write about this," it said. I smiled. "I already am," I replied. He didn't ask what I meant, and I didn't explain, because the truth is, I wasn't writing a song. I was writing this moment, this shift in perspective, this rediscovery of what matters. In interviews after that, I noticed how people still brought up that viral statement, but my answers had changed. I didn't dodge the question anymore. I said, what I said about Jimin wasn't about the past. It's about how we forget the value of being seen by someone who knows who we were before success. Most interviewers nodded politely, but I could tell some of them didn't really understand. And that's okay. Some things aren't meant to be fully understood by everyone. There was one more moment that solidified everything for me. During rehearsals for a concert months later, we were standing on stage, adjusting in-ears, running through set lists. It was routine, mechanical. But then, Jimin walked past me, bumped my shoulder, and said, "Don't forget the harmony." I laughed, thinking he meant the song. But then he added quietly, "Not just in the music." I looked at him, and he grinned. That's all it took. One simple sentence, and I knew he remembered everything we talked about. The silence, the distance, the understanding. Harmony. That night, as the lights came up and the crowd roared, I looked at him during one of the songs we'd performed together countless times. And for the first time in years, I wasn't performing for the audience. I was singing for the moment, for the friendship that had survived everything, for the quiet truth that connection, not fame, is the real rhythm of life. After the show, we didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. Some things are felt, not discussed. But later, alone in my hotel room, I sat by the window and thought about how one sentence, spoken without intention, had led to all this. To reconnection, to clarity, to a quieter kind of happiness. I realized something then. Life gives you mirrors in unexpected forms. Sometimes they're people, sometimes they're moments. Jimin had been that mirror for me, reflecting not just who I was, but who I had become and who I still had the chance to be. And maybe that's what true friendship really is. Not holding on to the past, but walking each other back to the present when we get lost. Now, months later, when I watch that interview clip again, I don't feel nervous or exposed. I feel grateful. Because without that unplanned moment, I might never have remembered the parts of myself that matter most. The parts that dream, love, and exist beyond applause. To everyone listening from the US, the UK, Australia, the Philippines, anywhere, remember this. Sometimes, what you say by accident is the truth your soul has been waiting to voice. Don't be afraid of those slips of honesty. They might just lead you home. And to Jimin, if you ever hear this again, thank you. Not just for the music, not just for the memories, but for reminding me that even when the world listens for noise, there's beauty in the quiet. Because that's where the real story always lives. It's strange how memory works. You think you've buried something, and then one quiet evening, it surfaces not as a full picture, but as fragments. A smell, a sound, a feeling. That's how it began for me one night, weeks after I'd visited Jimin. I was sitting in the studio alone, the lights low, the city outside pulsing softly like a heartbeat. I had opened an old folder on my laptop, one labeled simply, Practice 2014. Inside were hundreds of recordings, shaky videos from our trainee days, rough takes of songs that never made it anywhere, voices that cracked and laughed between exhaustion and hope. I pressed play on one file. The video started with static, and then there we were, two boys, sweating under fluorescent lights, trying to harmonize a verse that kept falling apart. Jimin was wearing a white shirt stained with effort, hair sticking to his forehead. I was sitting on the floor, head in my hands, frustrated beyond words. "I can't do this," I'd muttered. "It's never good enough." And then, like a voice reaching out from another life, I heard Jimin reply, "You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be real." I froze. The words hit harder now than they did then. I watched the video until it ended, but long after the screen went dark, the echo of his voice stayed. Maybe that was the beginning of everything, the moment I first learned that perfection was a myth, and that the people who love you don't care if you hit every note as long as you show up honestly. I sat there for hours replaying that memory, realizing how much of who I am was shaped by small sentences like that. Words said casually, but carrying truths that outlast years. I don't know what made me do it, but I picked up my phone and called him. It was past midnight. I expected him not to answer, but after 2 rings, he did. "You're awake," he said, his voice calm but alert. "Yeah," I replied. "I was watching old videos." He chuckled. "You're nostalgic tonight." "Do you remember telling me I didn't have to be perfect?" I asked. He was quiet for a while. "Yeah, I said that because you were driving yourself crazy. You didn't believe me back then." "I didn't," I admitted, "but I do now." He didn't reply, and for a moment, I thought the call had dropped. Then he said softly, "I'm glad. It took you long enough." That was all. We didn't talk much after that, but something in me shifted again. Sometimes it's not the conversations we have, but the ones we continue in silence that change us the most. The next morning, I woke up with a strange clarity. I went for a walk before sunrise. Seoul was still half asleep, and the air carried that in-between stillness that exists before the city wakes up. I walked past the Han River, thinking about how many versions of myself had crossed that bridge, some confident, some broken, all searching for something. And somewhere between the fading stars and the rising light, I realized what I had been trying to say all along when I spoke about Jimin. It wasn't about a single moment or confession. It was about gratitude for the kind of friendship that acts as a mirror, showing you the parts of yourself you've forgotten. A few days later, we were both scheduled for a recording session, different projects, same building. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting by the vending machine, staring at his phone. "You look tired," I said. "So do you?" he replied without looking up. I smiled. Some things never change. We ended up in the same studio by coincidence, or maybe not. The producer had stepped out, leaving the track looping quietly in the background. Jimin leaned back in his chair, listening to the rhythm. "You ever miss the early days?" he asked. "All the time," I said. "Back when everything was hard but simple." He nodded. "Yeah, back when we cared more about singing from our hearts than about charts." There was no bitterness in his tone, just truth. I knew exactly what he meant. In the early years, music was our language. We didn't need cameras or awards to validate it. We sang because it was the only way we knew how to feel alive. Somewhere along the way, we learned how to make perfection, but we forgot how to make presence. Jimin got up, walked over to the piano in the corner, and started playing something quietly. It was the same melody we had written together years ago, the one I played after the interview that night. I joined in instinctively, our voices meeting somewhere between memory and now. It wasn't perfect. Some notes fell apart, our timing was off, but there was something raw in it, something that felt real again. When the song ended, he said, "You know, you were always afraid of not being enough, but you never realized you already were." I didn't know what to say. For years, I had carried that invisible pressure to be the best, to represent something bigger than myself. But hearing him say that, I felt like I could finally breathe. "You were the first person who ever told me that," I said. He smiled. "Maybe it's time you start believing it." We sat there for hours after that, not recording anything official, just talking. About music, life, aging, in front of the world. About how strange it feels to have millions of people know your name but not your soul. He said something I'll never forget. "We've lived in spotlights for so long that we forgot how to stand in the dark without disappearing." Those words hit me like a confession, because it was true. For years, we equated visibility with existence. But sometimes, the most alive moments happen when no one's watching. That night, I drove home in silence. No music, no distractions. Just the rhythm of my thoughts catching up to me. I started writing again after that. Not for a project, not for a release, just for me. Late at night, I'd write letters to people I never intended to send. One of them was to Jimin. It began, "You were right about everything." I wrote about the nights we'd fought, the times I took his kindness for granted, the countless moments I wished I'd said thank you but didn't. By the time I finished, the page was stained with tears I hadn't realized were falling. I didn't send it. I didn't need to. Sometimes writing is enough. Sometimes the act of putting truth into words is its own kind of forgiveness. Weeks passed. The frenzy around my interview faded. The world moved on, as it always does. But something inside me didn't want to move on. I didn't want to forget what I learned not just about Jimin, but about myself. So I started doing something small every day. Before bed, I'd ask myself one question. Was I present today? At first, the answer was often no. But slowly, it began to change. I started noticing more the laughter of staff members, the smell of coffee in the morning, the feeling of sunlight hitting my skin after a long night in the studio. Life stopped feeling like a schedule and started feeling like an experience again. And through it all, Jimin was there, not always physically, but in spirit. In the way he reminded me, without words, to slow down. In the way his friendship existed quietly, like gravity unseen, but always pulling me back to what matters. One evening, after weeks of touring, I came home to find a small box waiting for me. No name on it, just a note, for when you forget. Inside was a Polaroid from years ago. We were sitting on the floor of a rehearsal room, laughing so hard that the picture came out blurry. On the back, Jimin had written one sentence. "You were real before you were famous." I don't think he meant it as a lesson, but it became one anyway. It reminded me that everything, every award, every headline means nothing if you lose the sincerity that made you start. That's the real story behind what I said in that interview. I didn't say it to shock anyone. I said it because some truths are too heavy to carry alone. I wish people understood that not everything is about drama or secrets. Sometimes it's just about gratitude for the people who shaped your heart when no one was watching. Jimin was one of those people for me. He still is. The next time I saw him was at a rehearsal for a charity event. We hadn't planned to perform together, but at the last minute, the organizers asked if we could. It was unplanned, unrehearsed. We looked at each other across the stage, and I could see the same thought in his eyes. Let's just sing. No pressure, no perfection, just presence. And when we did, something magical happened. The audience didn't know our story, but they felt it. You could feel the energy in the room shift, like every unsaid thing between us had turned into sound. After the show, he came up to me backstage, towel around his neck, sweat dripping, that same smile I remembered from a decade ago. "You did well," he said. "So did you." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "You know, you've changed." "I hope so," I said. "Yeah," he nodded, "but in a good way." That's the thing about healing. It doesn't happen in big revelations. It happens in small recognitions, in knowing that someone sees your growth without you having to prove it. Months have passed since then. I don't know if the world still talks about that interview. Maybe they've moved on to the next story, the next headline. But for me, it's not about what the world remembers. It's about what I learned to remember again, that the truest connections don't need constant validation. They just need to be honored. Sometimes I think back to that night in Jimin's apartment, to the tea growing cold between us, to the silence that healed more than words ever could. I realize now that we didn't just rebuild a friendship that night, we rediscovered something bigger. The courage to be present, even when it's uncomfortable. And maybe that's the lesson I was meant to learn all along. That honesty, once spoken, has the power to realign everything around it. That love, real love, doesn't fade with distance or time. It transforms, it matures, it deepens, and sometimes it waits patiently for you to finally understand it. So when people ask me now what I meant that day, when I said those words about Jimin, I just smile. Because the answer isn't something I can explain in an interview. It's something I live every day, quietly, intentionally, with gratitude. And if you're listening to this from wherever you are, from the US, the UK, Australia, the Philippines, or anywhere in the world, maybe this is what I hope you take away. Sometimes, the people who challenge you the most are the ones who love you the deepest. Sometimes, the person you least expect to change your life already has. And maybe that's why I said what I said. Because after all these years, after all the noise and distance, there's still one truth that remains untouched. Jimin reminds me of who I am when the world forgets. And for that, I'll always be grateful. There's something about studios at night that feels like confession. The lights are dim, the air still, the hum of the equipment soft like a heartbeat. You can almost hear time slowing down, waiting for you to say something honest. That's how it felt the first night. Jimin and I ended up working together again. Not because of a plan, but because fate has a strange sense of timing. We'd both been scheduled for a collaborative recording, just a small project for charity, something simple and stripped down. It wasn't about chart positions or numbers, just two voices, one message. Maybe that's why I felt safe enough for both of us to say yes without thinking too hard. When I walked into the studio, he was already there, leaning over the console, headphones around his neck, hair tucked behind his ear. The same posture, the same focus, but something quieter in the way he moved, less about performance, more about presence. "You're late," he said without looking up. "You're early," I replied. He laughed softly. Some things never change. We started with the basics, warm-ups, scales, harmonies. It felt mechanical at first, two professionals doing what they've done for years. But as the night stretched on, the space between us began to soften. I noticed how he hummed between takes, the way he always did when he was thinking. I noticed how his voice cracked slightly on the high notes, and how instead of hiding it, he smiled and tried again. And I realized something simple but profound. Vulnerability looks different on everyone, but on Jimin, it always looked beautiful. At one point, I took off my headphones and said, "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" He turned toward me, expression unreadable. "Every day," he said. "But sometimes, I wonder if we've actually arrived anywhere, or if we're still running." That question sat heavy in the air. I knew what he meant. Success had carried us around the world, but somehow, we were still chasing the same invisible horizon. "Maybe arriving isn't the point," I said quietly. "Maybe it's about learning how to stop running for a while." He looked at me for a long time, then nodded. "You've changed?" he said. "I hope so. You have. You listen more now." That made me laugh. I used to think listening was a waste of time. "It's the opposite," he said. "It's the only way to really hear yourself." Oy. We fell into silence after that. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that feels sacred, like the room itself is breathing with you. The track played softly in the background, a song about finding light after loss. Fitting, I thought, because that's what this moment felt like. Two people who'd lost their way back to each other finding it again, not through apology or explanation, but through sound. Around 2 a.m., he asked if I wanted to take a break. We went outside, sitting on the steps by the parking lot, watching the streetlights flicker. The night was cool, the city quieter than usual. He took a deep breath. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Why did you really say that about me in that interview?" I hesitated. There it was, the question that had been waiting all along. "Because it was true," I said, "and because I was tired of pretending that truth needs permission." He didn't look at me right away. He stared at the ground, hands folded, jaw tense. You know, when I first heard it, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was scared, I think, not of what people would say, but of what it meant. "What did it mean to you?" "That maybe we never said out loud how much we actually needed each other," he said softly. "We just assumed the other person knew." That hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so long thinking that distance was proof of maturity, that real friendship didn't need constant validation. But maybe silence can be a kind of neglect too. Maybe the people we love still need to be reminded that we see them. "I did know," I said finally, "but I should have said it sooner." He smiled faintly. "Well, you said it to the whole world instead." I laughed, the sound half regret, half relief. "Yeah, I guess that's my way of overcompensating." "Maybe it's your way of healing," he said. There was something in his tone, gentle but grounded, like he wasn't trying to fix anything, just understand it. And maybe that's what we'd both been missing, not resolution, but recognition. We went back inside, and something shifted. The song we'd been working on suddenly felt alive. We sang it differently this time, not like we were recording a track, but like we were telling the story of everything we'd been through. When we finished, the producer looked at us and said quietly, "That's the take." Jimin turned to me, his eyes glistening slightly. "You felt that, right?" I nodded. "Yeah, it felt like coming home." Later that night, after he left, I stayed behind in the studio, replaying the recording. There was something raw in the way our voices blended, an honesty that couldn't be manufactured. I realized then that music had always been our language when words failed. Every fight, every silence, every misunderstanding, we had always found our way back through a song. Maybe that's why the universe put us in that room again, to remind us that connection isn't always about conversation. Sometimes it's about resonance. Over the next few weeks, we spent more time together, not constantly, but naturally. Shared meals, shared laughter, shared silences. It was like rediscovering an old friendship in a new language. I found myself noticing things I used to overlook. The way he listens when others speak, the way he always says thank you to staff, the quiet grace he carries even when he's tired. Fame hadn't hardened him, it had softened him in ways that made him stronger. One evening, we were watching the playback of a live performance. There was a shot of us standing side by side under the stage lights, smiling. "You know what's funny?" he said. "That smile, it's real now. It didn't used to be." I looked at him. "Yeah," I said. "Because now, it's not for them, it's for us." He nodded, eyes still on the screen. I think we both forgot how to smile for ourselves. That night, after he left, I wrote in my notebook again. Real friendship isn't about never breaking, it's about never pretending you didn't. A few days later, the charity song was released. It wasn't promoted heavily, just quietly uploaded online. But somehow, it went viral anyway, not because of marketing, but because people could feel the sincerity in it. They called it "The Sound of Healing." Comments flooded in. You can hear the love in their voices. "This feels like forgiveness and melody." I read them all, not out of vanity, but because it reminded me that the world still recognizes truth when it hears it. Then something unexpected happened. During a fan event, someone asked me, "What's the one thing you've learned from Jimin?" Without thinking, I said, "That real love doesn't need attention, it needs intention." The crowd went quiet, then cheered. But what they didn't see was that as I said it, Jimin was standing just a few feet away, listening. When our eyes met, he smiled, not the kind you give for cameras, but the kind that says, "I heard you." After the event, we walked backstage together. He said, "You're really leaning into this honest era, huh?" I shrugged. Maybe honesty was the only thing I hadn't tried yet. He grinned. "Don't stop. It suits you." That's the thing about healing. It's contagious. When one person chooses honesty, it gives everyone around them permission to do the same. And maybe that's why our story matters, not because it's dramatic or perfect, but because it's human. Months later, when the year was ending, I found myself back on that same bench by the river, the one I sat on after the interview months before. The air was cold, the water reflecting the city's lights like scattered stars. I thought about everything that had happened, the misunderstanding, the silence, the reunion, the rediscovery, and I realized that all of it was necessary. The distance, the mistakes, the unspoken words, they were all chapters leading to this one. I took out my phone and sent Jimin a message. "Thank you for still being here." A few minutes later, he replied, "Where else would I be?" And somehow, that one line said everything. It's easy to think that love, whether in friendship or beyond, has to be loud to be real. But the older I get, the more I believe the opposite. The realest kind of love is the one that exists quietly, in presence, in patience, in the willingness to show up even after the noise fades. So now, when people bring up that interview and say, "You surprised everyone with what you said about Jimin," I smile. Because I know the truth, they were surprised because they heard honesty in a place where they weren't used to finding it. Honesty sounds shocking when you live in a world built on performance. But for us, it wasn't a revelation, it was a return. And maybe that's what this whole journey was about. Not confession, not controversy, but coming home to ourselves, to each other, to the quiet truth that connection is the only thing that ever really matters. So to everyone listening from the US, the UK, Australia, the Philippines, or anywhere in the world, this is what I want you to remember. Say what you mean, even if your voice shakes. Because one day, the person who needs to hear it might not be here anymore. And the only thing worse than being misunderstood is never being heard at all. That's what Jimin taught me. That's what that unexpected sentence really meant. Not a revelation, not a secret, just a truth. Long overdue, finally finding its way into the world. The decision to leave Seoul came quietly, like most important decisions do. There was no grand announcement, no schedule change, no public reason. I just felt something inside me say, go. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was instinct, maybe it was the way Jimin had said after our last session, "You look like you need air." Whatever it was, 2 days later, we were sitting side by side on a train bound for the southern coast. No staff, no cameras, no agenda. Just us and the sound of the tracks cutting through distance. The carriage was nearly empty. The windows framed rolling hills and winter trees. We didn't talk much at first. Sometimes, silence is the only language that makes sense between people who've already said too much. I remember the rhythm of the train, steady and hypnotic, and the faint reflection of Jimin's face in the glass. He looked peaceful, the kind of peace you earn only after surviving chaos. Halfway through the trip, he turned to me and said, "Do you realize this is the first time we've traveled somewhere without a reason in over 10 years?" I smiled. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" "Strange, but good," he said, "like we're not running anymore." I nodded, watching the blur of landscape outside. The speed of the train made the world look like a painting, soft edges, fleeting shapes, impossible to grasp. Maybe that's what life really is, I thought. A series of moments passing too fast to hold, unless you slow down long enough to notice them. We arrived just before sunset. The air smelled like salt and pine. The town was small, the kind of place where the sea felt close even when you couldn't see it. We checked into a modest inn by the harbor. No one recognized us, or if they did, they didn't say anything. There was a relief in that anonymity, a freedom I hadn't felt in years. After we dropped our bags, Jimin suggested we walk. The streets were narrow, lined with shuttered shops and lanterns flickering in the evening breeze. Somewhere, someone was playing an old song on a radio. It sounded like nostalgia itself, thin, imperfect, but full of heart. We found a small pier at the edge of town. The sea stretched endlessly, the horizon bleeding into gold and violet. The sound of waves was rhythmic, meditative. Jimin leaned against the railing, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if none of this happened?" he asked. "You mean BTS?" "Everything," he said. "Fame, pressure, the world watching our every move. What if we'd just been normal?" I thought about that for a while. The question carried both innocence and exhaustion. "Sometimes I do," I admitted. "But then I think about how even if none of this happened, I'd still want to have met you. That part feels non-negotiable." He smiled faintly, looking at the horizon. "You always say things that sound simple but hit hard." "It's the truth," I said. "Everything else could have been different, but not that." We stayed there as the sun disappeared completely, replaced by a deep blue sky stitched with stars. The wind picked up, cold enough to sting. He shivered, and I instinctively took off my scarf, wrapping it around his neck. "You'll catch a cold," I said. He laughed softly. "Still taking care of me, huh?" "Old habits," I replied. We didn't speak for a while after that. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of all the years, all the laughter, all the pain that didn't need words. Somewhere behind us, a bell rang from the harbor. Time was still moving, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like it was moving gently. Later that night, we sat by the fireplace in the inn's small lounge. The owner had left us tea and some fruit, and the crackle of firewood filled the room with warmth. Jimin stared into the flames. "Do you ever feel guilty?" he asked suddenly. "For what?" "For being tired of something we prayed for," he said. "For wanting to rest when so many people are still dreaming of being where we are." I looked at him, understanding exactly what he meant. "All the time," I said. "But I don't think gratitude and exhaustion cancel each other out. You can love something deeply and still need space from it." He nodded slowly, as if letting the words sink in. "I used to think taking a break meant losing momentum," he said. "Now I think it means saving yourself." That line stayed with me. I wanted to tell him that he had saved me many times without realizing it through his faith, his patience, his quiet presence, but I didn't. Some truths are meant to be felt, not spoken. We talked late into the night. About everything and nothing. About the first time we performed together, about the fear of growing older in an industry obsessed with youth, about the loneliness of being adored by millions but understood by few. There was something cleansing about that conversation. It stripped away the noise until only the core remained, two people trying to understand what it means to live fully without losing themselves. The next morning, we woke before dawn and walked to the beach. The air was sharp with cold, the sky a muted gray. The tide had pulled back, leaving smooth stones and seashells scattered like memories. We didn't speak. We just walked, the sound of our footsteps blending with the waves. Then, without warning, Jimin stopped and said, "Do you remember that night we almost quit?" I knew exactly which one he meant. Years ago, during one of our hardest seasons, we'd had a fight loud, messy, full of frustration. I had stormed out, saying I was done. He followed me, grabbed my arm, and said, then let's quit together. That broke me. I couldn't leave after that. Because even in anger, he refused to let me fall alone. Yeah, I said. I remember. He smiled sadly. You know, I think that was the night I realized we'd never really lose each other. Not for real. Even if we tried, I said. Even then. The sun began to rise behind the clouds, pale gold bleeding into the water. It felt symbolic, like something ending and beginning at once. I took out my phone and snapped a picture. Not for social media, just for us. As we headed back toward the inn, Jimin said quietly, "You know what the hardest part about growing up is? Realizing that not every story needs an ending. Some just keep evolving." I thought about that the whole way home. He was right. What we had wasn't a story with a clear beginning or end. It was a continuum, something that shifted, deepened, breathed. When we returned to Seoul, everything looked the same but felt different. The city's noise no longer overwhelmed me. The lights no longer blinded. There was peace in knowing that sometimes you have to step away from everything to see it clearly again. A week later, we were back in the studio, recording a demo. It wasn't for release, just something personal. A slow, acoustic track. Halfway through, he stopped singing and said, "I think we should call it Silence Between Stars." "Why?" I asked. "Because that's what we are," he said. "Not the noise, not the light, just a space that lets everything breathe." I smiled. It was perfect. We recorded it in one take. No corrections, no polish. When it ended, we just sat there, listening to the last note fade into nothing. It felt like closure and continuation all at once. Afterward, I walked him to his car. Before he got in, he turned to me and said, "Whatever happens next, don't forget this." "I won't," I said. "Promise?" "Promise." He smiled, then drove away. I watched the taillights disappear into the city until they were just two small dots, swallowed by distance. That night, I sat by my window and played our recording again. It sounded like memory and forgiveness intertwined, like two souls speaking in a language only they could understand. And I realized that the journey wasn't about returning to who we were, it was about embracing who we had become. The world would never know this version of us, the quiet, unguarded, human one. And maybe that's how it should be. Some stories don't belong to the world. They belong to the space between hearts that don't need to prove their connection anymore. So, to everyone listening from the US, the UK, Australia, the Philippines, or anywhere in the world, this is what I've learned. Peace isn't found in applause. It's found in moments like this, watching the sunrise with someone who's seen every version of you and stayed anyway. And maybe that's what that unexpected sentence was all along. A reminder that love, in any form, is not about possession or explanation. It's about recognition. About looking at someone and saying, "You've been here all along, haven't you?" That's what Jimin is to me. The silence between stars. The stillness between chaos. The proof that sometimes the most extraordinary thing isn't what the world sees, it's what survives quietly when no one's watching. When peace finally found me, it didn't arrive like music or applause. It came quietly through still mornings, through ordinary moments that no longer felt empty. For weeks after that trip with Jimin, I carried the calm we found by the sea like something fragile, afraid that if I moved too fast, I might lose it. I worked, I trained, I smiled, but this time, the rhythm was different. I wasn't chasing the next thing. I was finally living inside the moment I was in. Then, one night, it happened. The thing that always happens when silence starts to heal you. Someone disturbed it. It began with a notification. A fan account had posted grainy photos of two figures walking along a pier at dusk. The caption read, "Jungkook and Jimin spotted together in the South Coast." The images weren't clear, but they didn't need to be. People saw what they wanted to see. Within hours, it spread everywhere. Hashtags, headlines, debates, theories, screens lit up with opinions disguised as truth. When I woke up the next morning, my phone was a wall of noise. Are they together? Was this a secret reunion? What did Jungkook mean when he said Jimin is the silence between stars? Even that phrase, something private I'd written in my notebook, had somehow made its way online. For the first few hours, I tried to ignore it. I brewed coffee, fed Bam, turned on some music. But curiosity has a way of eroding peace. I opened my phone. Every headline felt like a distorted echo of something pure. They weren't malicious, Just careless people trying to define what they could never feel from a distance. Hybe called later that day. My manager's voice was calm, measured, but I could hear the undercurrent of worry. We might need to issue a statement, he said, even if it's just to clarify that it was a private trip. I understood. I've lived this life long enough to know how the cycle works. But still, I asked, what are we clarifying, exactly? That two friends walked by the ocean? There was silence on the other end, then a sigh. You know how people are, Jungkook. They fill the blanks with what sells. I looked out the window. The city stretched endlessly below me, millions of lights, each one a person trying to make sense of their own stories. Then let them, I said. We don't owe an explanation for being human. After I hung up, I called Jimin. He answered immediately, his voice steady. You saw it too, huh? Yeah. Do we need to say something? I paused. I don't think so. Let them talk. We'll live. He chuckled softly. That's very unlike you. Maybe I'm learning. There was warmth in his silence. Then he said, good. Let them wonder. The truth doesn't always need defending. That night, I went for a drive. The city lights blurred against the windshield like reflections of old memories. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of how public our lives had become. Billboards, ads, faces, frozen in time. But for the first time, I didn't feel trapped by it. I felt detached, almost compassionate toward the world's curiosity. People didn't gossip because they hated us. They speculated because they cared. They wanted to feel close to something real. I parked by the Han River and sat there, phone face down, listening to the quiet hum of life around me. Somewhere, a couple laughed. A jogger passed by, a dog barked in the distance. It struck me how small fame feels compared to the vastness of ordinary life. All this noise, all these opinions, they were just waves hitting the surface. What mattered was what stayed beneath. The next day, Jimin came to the studio. He brought coffee black for me, caramel for himself. You holding up? He asked. I nodded. Yeah, you? Better than I thought, he said. I used to panic when things like this happen. Now I just let people talk. I can't live my life correcting them. Same, I said. It's weirdly freeing, isn't it? He smiled. Maybe this is what growing up feels like. We spent that afternoon working on new material. The mood was light, playful. Between takes, he hummed a melody that stopped me in my tracks. What's that? I asked. Something I wrote a while ago, he said. I never finished it. Can I hear the rest? He hesitated, then nodded. His voice filled the room soft, aching, beautiful. The lyrics were simple. If the world misunderstands, let it. I only need to be understood by one. When he finished, I couldn't speak. It was too honest, too close. He looked at me nervously. Too much? It's perfect, I said, but maybe not for everyone to hear. He smiled knowingly. Yeah, some songs are just for two people. We didn't record it that day. We didn't need to. The moment itself was the recording of memory, written in sound, never meant for release. Over the next few weeks, the noise online began to fade, replaced by newer rumors, fresher stories. But something stayed different between us. We had moved past explanation into quiet understanding. Sometimes we'd text late at night, just one or two words. You okay? Yeah. You? Same. No grand declarations, just small affirmations that we were still here. One night, after a long day of rehearsals, I got a message from him. Come outside. When I stepped out of the building, he was there, sitting on the hood of his car, eating tteokbokki from a paper cup. You looked like you needed a break, he said. You stalk my exhaustion levels now? He laughed. You wear them on your face. We sat there in the parking lot, sharing food under flickering streetlights. It felt like we were back in the old days. No fame, no cameras, just two kids talking about nothing and everything. At one point, he said, you know, for years I thought we were defined by what we gave the world. Now I think we're defined by what we keep for ourselves. That's deep, I said. Did you rehearse that? Maybe, he teased. But it's true. He looked at me then, serious again. Whatever happens next, I don't want us to lose this space where we can just be people. You won't, I said. Not as long as I have a car and you bring snacks. He laughed so hard he almost dropped the cup. Deal. It was simple moments like that, ordinary, unplanned, that reminded me why his presence mattered. Not because of nostalgia, not because of shared fame, but because he represented balance. In a world that demanded perfection, he was my reminder to be human. Months passed, and life resumed its usual rhythm: music, travel, interviews. But now, there was a softness underneath everything. A new kind of strength that came from knowing I didn't have to hide or explain who I cared about.